This is a reading from Evidence of Satan in the Modern World by Leon Christiani. The Deliverance of Joseph. Curiously enough, when Thibault returned to his home, he remembered nothing. The 4 years he had passed in a state of possession had been obliterated from his memory. He no longer recognized his parish priest, the very pious Abbé Bray, who has been compared with the saintly Curé d'Ars, and who suffered like him from demonic infestations. He could not remember having seen the new town hall. He had brought with him from Strasbourg some blessed medallions, which he offered to his brother. Joseph threw them to the ground, saying, "Keep that sort of thing for yourself. I don't want it." "Has he gone mad?" Thibault asked his mother, who was careful not to let him know that he himself had been in the same state, for he remembered nothing of it. On Wednesday, 6th of October, 1869, the younger boy suddenly exclaimed, "My two companions!" It was understood that he meant Oripas and Ipes, the devils cast out of Thibault, "are weaklings. Now I am the master. I am the strongest. I shall stay here for another 6 years. I'm not afraid of any old priest." "Are you so strong?" asked the mayor, a Monsieur Treche, an excellent Christian. "Of course," he replied. "I like it here, and I'm very comfortable. I've settled down in a quiet spot, and I shan't leave it till I want to." The Abbé Bray, however, had immediately requested the bishop's permission to undertake the exorcism, whereas Thibault had reverted to the satisfactory behavior of former years, going to church and school and confession. With no recollection of his 4 years of possession, Joseph's state became steadily worse. The bishop's authorization arrived at last, and the curé fixed the date of exorcism for 27th of October. This date was, however, kept secret to prevent crowds assembling. It was a Sunday. Only a few witnesses had been invited, and the ceremony took place in the chapel of the cemetery of Bernkirch, a quarter of an hour from the village. Together with the mayor, Monsieur Treche, there were the boy's parents, the schoolmaster, the station master, the headmistress of the girls' school, Professor Lachemann, and 2 gentlemen of the names Spies and Martineau. At 6 in the morning, when the mass began, the possessed boy began to kick and twist in every direction. His arms and legs had to be tied, but before the prayers at the foot of the altar were finished, the boy had managed to struggle free and kick the celebrant. Monsieur Martineau then picked him up and held him on his knee. The boy began to utter inarticulate cries, yapping like a puppy, grunting like a young pig. To the surprise of the onlookers, however, he remained calm from the Sanctus to the conclusion of the Mass. Having been unvested from his liturgical vestments, the curé put on his surplice and stole and began the exorcism. When he came to the ritual dialogue with the devil, the Abbé Bray summoned him to declare how many demons were there in the boy. "There's no need for you to know," was the curt answer. When the priest returned to the attack, the devil tossed him the name of Ipes, one of the devils who had possessed the brother. During the reading of St. John's Gospel, the possessed boy cried out, "I will not go." There followed a torrent of insults. This continued for 3 hours. The onlookers began to feel tired and discouraged, but the good priest, himself exhausted and sweating, exhorted them to stand firm. All the while, Monsieur Treche, the mayor, had been holding the boy. Quite worn out, he passed him over to Professor Lachemann, at which the devil remarked, "So you're there too, flat nose." Meanwhile, the priest, on his knees before the altar, had been praying for a moment or two, vowing to perform a novena if the exorcism were successful. Descending the altar steps, he said to the boy, "I adjure you in the name of the Immaculate Virgin Mary to leave this child." Satan raged. "Why does he come after me with this great lady? Now I am obliged to go." At these words, a wave of emotion swept over the onlookers. All of them understood that deliverance was at hand, and that the Virgin Mary was to be its cause. The curé repeated his summons. "I am leaving," screamed the devil. "I'm going into a herd of swine." "To hell," commanded the priest. "I want to go into a flock of geese," begged the devil. "To hell," repeated the priest, adding each time the ritual adjuration. "I don't know the way," said Satan. "I'm going into a flock of sheep." To hell! Now I'm obliged to go, wailed the demon. At these words, the boy turned right and left, stretched himself, blew out his cheeks, had one last convulsive spasm, and then fell back, suddenly inert and silent. He was released from his bonds, and his arms fell limply to his sides, and his head lolled backwards. This only lasted a few moments. Then he was observed to stretch like a man waking from sleep, and to open his eyes, which he had kept shut throughout the exorcism. He seemed surprised to find himself in the chapel, with people all around him. From the beginning, the devil had announced, "If I'm obliged to go, I will mark my departure by breaking something." In fact, the rosary and the little pectoral cross, which had been hung around the boy's neck, were found to be broken to pieces. Since he had been tied hand and foot, he could not have broken them himself. The scene had profoundly shaken all the onlookers. They sang of Te Deum and the litanies of the Blessed Virgin, the Salve Regina. Their voices were half strangled by sobs. More than once the Abbé Bray was almost overwhelmed by his emotion. It was certainly a unique testimony. Near the village square at Ilfirth, in a garden on the site of the boy's home, there is a beautiful monument erected to perpetuate the memory of these events. It is a tall column decorated with stars and surmounted by a statue of Mary Immaculate. On the pedestal there is a Latin inscription which runs as follows: "In perpetual memory of the deliverance of two boys possessed by devils, Theobald and Joseph Berner, granted by the intercession of the Blessed Mary Immaculate, A.D. 1869. It was erected by subscription in 1872 and is still scrupulously maintained. The case of Hélène Poirier. Before going on to the remarkable case of the bewitched woman of Piacenza, we shall deal briefly with some other cases, particularly with that of Hélène Poirier. She was a woman of excellent character, who endured the most terrifying ordeals, and who died in 1914 at the age of 80. Her misfortunes are related in detail by Canon Champeau in his book Une possédée contemporaine, 1834 to 1914. Paris, Tiki. The author of this work had detailed and voluminous documentation at his disposal. He was at the time director of an establishment at Yen, Loiret, and had himself been eyewitness of many of the events which he relates. In addition, he had an ample supply of material collected by the two priests who succeeded him in the parish of Coulon, where the possessed woman lived. Further, the woman herself was for many years in Canon Champeau's service, and he remained in touch with her until her death. Hélène Poirier was an honest country girl who worked as a laundress. No one could say why this simple woman was subjected, with God's permission, to an unending series of demonic persecutions. She was first obsessed, then possessed, the two words indicating different intensities of demonic manifestation. Since God would not permit such things to happen if they were devoid of all purposive quality, it is probable that they are intended to demonstrate the terrible dangers to which we should be exposed if the devil had a free hand. We know that, fortunately for us poor humans, he is not permitted to do all that he would like. But to return to Hélène Poirier, her life is, so to speak, a tissue of demonic activities, tricks, rough jokes, horseplay, beatings, levitations, and the like. She was literally possessed at least twice over a period of 6 years, and in each case she was exorcised. In the interval between these crises, she was the victim of more or less violent obsessions. For the greater part of her life she was a martyr to the devil's activities and his incessant cruelty. Yet, on the other hand, she gave proof of the Abbé Sodro's statement that the courage and patience of the possessed person may be a source of great spiritual power. In the second part of her life, Hélène Poirier was granted marvelous compensations for this demonic persecution by the intervention of her guardian angel and visions of the Blessed Virgin and of our Lord himself. We can only give a brief summary of some of the innumerable instances of the violence of this diabolic persecution. Whilst she was still living in acute poverty with her mother, Hélène would often receive from an invisible enemy kicks and slaps, even attempts at strangulation, all of which her mother had to witness without being able to help her. There were no fantasies of the imagination, for her face, these were no fantasies of the imagination, for her face, her arms, her legs would all bear, for weeks, the marks of the treatment they had received. The devil would appear to her in the most hideous shapes. He would overpower her by his weight, throwing her to the ground. This happened frequently, and would breathe in her face. There were numerous instances of levitation. In each case, Helene was seized by the hair, always by some invisible power, pulled around the room, lifted from the ground, and finally thrown in a half-strangled state upon her bed. Once she was suddenly seized by the head and transported over the neighboring houses, a distance of some 45 yards. At night, she often had the same experience as the curé d'Ars of some infernal spirit shaking the curtains of her bed and running their curtain rings noisily backwards and forwards for hours on end. Once, Helene shouted for help, and when help arrived, there were more than 20 witnesses to this agitation of the curtains. The names are given, so there can be no doubt as to the reality of the facts quoted. Although Hélène Poirier was able to work through all these afflictions to a high degree of saintliness, most of us would be content to pray that we might not be led to sanctify along such a terrifying path. Two other cases of possession. In his book on the possessions at Ilfurth, Canon François Jacquer has also included, though with less detail, two other more recent cases of possession. There is, first, the case of a young Bantu girl, Claire Germaine Selle, of Natal, who was twice possessed and twice delivered by exorcism, once on the 10th of September 1906 and again on the 24th of April 1907. This young African girl, who had been baptized in her cradle, was brought up by nuns of the mission. Her family background was one of conflict and frequent quarrels. As a girl, her health was delicate, and she was also very temperamental. Soon after her first communion, she ceased to partake of the sacraments. Her eyes shone with a somber gleam. At night she was very agitated, and she would be heard to cry like a madwoman, "I am lost! My confession was sacrilegious! My communion was sacrilegious! I shall hang myself!" One day she passed a note to the missionary, Father Erasme, in which she said she had sold herself to the devil. On the 20th of August 1906, she appeared more tormented than ever. She was gnashing her teeth, barking like a dog, and calling for help. "Sister," she cried, "send for Father Erasme. I want to confess everything. Quickly, quickly, the devil wants to kill me. He's my master. I've nothing blessed anymore, and I have lost all your medallions." Up to that moment, it had been possible to believe that it was a simple case of mania, but several very definite symptoms emerged to show that it was a case of genuine possession. Germaine had horror. She had a horror of all blessed objects and pushed them aside, saying that they burned her. She knew of remote, hidden events. She understood all the languages used in speaking to her, and could repeat in Latin the long formulae of the ritual, even correcting any error made by those who recited it. Her devil was talkative, and enjoyed revealing the most intimate secrets and hidden sins of those who were present, which made most of them retreat hastily. Any invocation of Jesus or Mary enraged him. He displayed the most cruel ingenuity in his persecution of the poor girl. Sometimes he would lift her into the air in spite of all efforts to hold her down. Sometimes he would inflate her chest or stomach. Sometimes her head became monstrous. Her cheeks inflated like balloons. Her neck would lengthen, and a hideous goiter would make its appearance. A lump would form under her skin and travel over every part of her body. At other times, she would writhe on the ground, darting out her tongue like a serpent. Yet, if she was sprinkled with holy water or blessed by a priest, all these symptoms would disappear. On the whole, the spectacle of the effects of possession had a very great effect on the onlookers. Many were converted, and there was a great increase in religious observance. The exorcism, which twice delivered the unfortunate girl, demonstrated the power of the prayers of the Church. The final exorcism was conducted by the bishop himself, Monsignor Henri de Lalle, Oblate of Mary Immaculate. During the ceremony, an incident occurred which would be unbelievable if it had not been witnessed by so many persons. After 2.5 hours of prayer, and the possessed girl was suddenly levitated 6 feet from the ground, and from this height called out to the confounded bishop, "What's the matter, bishop? Why do you have to stand there gaping at me? Do as I do." This accompanied by a shrill cackle that made the spectators' blood run cold. Yet, finally, she was set free. Her life afterwards was a model of piety until she died 6 years later, on the 14th of March, 1913, of a chest complaint. The devil never reappeared. Her ordeals, therefore, resembled that of the Ilfrith boys, whose afflictions were not repeated, but who also died young. Thibault the elder at the age of 16, and the younger, Joseph, in 1882, at the age of 25.